In April 2026, the United States sanctioned a Chinese oil refinery for allegedly buying Iranian crude. Normally, that kind of story disappears into the machinery of sanctions policy, where tanker names, shell companies, compliance notices, and government press releases all blur into one long bureaucratic fog. This time was different. The refinery was Hengli Petrochemical's Dalian refinery, one of the more significant players in China's refining system. Washington accused it of purchasing billions of dollars worth of Iranian oil and said the crude had moved through sanctioned vessels connected to Iran's shadow fleet network. Then Beijing answered in a way that turned a sanctions case into something much larger. China's Commerce Ministry issued a blocking order against U.S. sanctions on 5 Chinese refiners, including Hengli, Shandong Jincheng, Hebei Xinhai, Shouguang Luqing, and Shandong Shengsing. The message was blunt. Chinese companies should not recognize, implement, or comply with those U.S. sanctions. That is the real story. This is not only about Iranian oil. It is about whether Washington still has the power to police global trade when more of that trade is being moved outside the dollar system. It is about whether China is willing to accept American secondary sanctions as a global law, or whether Beijing now believes it is strong enough to say no. For decades, the U.S. sanctions system worked because most major global trade eventually touched the American financial system. If a bank needed dollar clearing, if a company needed access to U.S. markets, if a ship needed Western insurance, or if a trader needed global financing, Washington had leverage.
The dollar was not just a currency. It was a checkpoint. That is why sanctions were so powerful. They did not require the U.S. to physically stop every shipment. They made the rest of the world afraid to touch the shipment. Iran understood this. China understood this. Russia understood this. Everyone understood this. So the workaround began. Iranian oil does not always move through the world as Iranian oil. It often travels through a maze of shadow tankers, ship-to-ship transfers, shell companies, renamed cargoes, and paperwork that quietly changes the apparent origin of the crude. A cargo may begin as Iranian oil, pass through a transfer near Southeast Asia, and later appear in records as something else, sometimes Malaysian or Indonesian blend. By the time it reaches an independent Chinese refinery, the trail has been deliberately muddied. This is not elegant. It is not clean. It is sanctions evasion with grease on its hands. But it works well enough to matter. China has become the central buyer in this system because it has the demand, the refining capacity, and the political willingness to resist U.S. pressure. Independent Chinese refiners, often called teapot refiners, can take discounted crude that larger global-facing firms may avoid. Iranian oil is cheaper because it is sanctioned. For refiners under pressure from weak margins, that discount is not a footnote. It is the business model.
This is why Washington started targeting Chinese refiners more aggressively. But Hengli is not just another teapot refiner. That is why this case matters. Hengli's Dalian refinery has roughly 400,000 barrels per day of capacity. It is not some tiny backyard operation hiding behind a warehouse and a fax machine from 1997. It is a serious industrial asset inside China's energy system. By targeting Hengli, Washington was sending a message that the enforcement campaign was moving up the food chain. The U.S. was no longer satisfied with sanctioning obscure shipping companies, old tankers, brokers, and disposable shell firms. It was testing whether a larger Chinese industrial company could be made radioactive in global markets. And in some ways, the pressure worked immediately.
Hengli's shares fell after the sanctions announcement. The company denied trading with Iran and said it had enough crude inventory to continue operations for more than 3 months. More importantly, reports emerged that Hengli had to restructure parts of its Singapore trading operation after Western counterparties became nervous. That is the sanctions mechanism in miniature. Washington does not need to shut down every pipe, port, and refinery unit. It only needs to make enough banks, brokers, insurers, and trading partners ask one ugly question: is this relationship worth the risk? Inside China, Beijing can defend Hengli. Outside China, things become more complicated. A Chinese company may say it does not recognize U.S. sanctions. A Singapore broker may still decide not to touch it. A Western insurer may walk away. A bank with U.S. exposure may refuse the transaction. A commodity trader may decide the margin is not worth getting dragged into the Office of Foreign Assets Control's lovely little torture garden. That is why China's response is so important. Beijing was not only complaining, it was using a legal tool designed for this exact conflict. China's blocking rules are meant to counter foreign laws that Beijing sees as improper extraterritorial pressure. In plain English, China is saying that the United States cannot use American domestic law to control Chinese trade with Iran. That creates a dangerous compliance trap.
If a Chinese company obeys U.S. sanctions, it may run into trouble with Beijing. If it obeys Beijing, it may lose access to the U.S.-led global system. This is where the story becomes much bigger than one refinery. The old sanctions world was built around a simple assumption. Most serious companies would choose access to the U.S. system over business with sanctioned countries. China is now trying to weaken that assumption. Not everywhere, not completely, not overnight, but enough to make Washington nervous. The key question is whether de-dollarization changes the balance. Many people misunderstand de-dollarization. They talk about it as if the moment oil is settled in yuan, U.S. sanctions magically die. That is too simple and honestly a little too cute. Yuan settlement does weaken one major U.S. weapon. If China buys Iranian oil in yuan through Chinese banks, Washington cannot simply block the dollar transaction because there may not be one. That matters. If the oil is priced in yuan, financed by Chinese institutions, shipped by friendly networks, insured outside the West, and consumed by a refinery with limited international exposure, U.S. sanctions become harder to enforce.
But de-dollarization does not eliminate sanctions power. It changes where the pressure is applied. The battlefield moves from payments to networks. Who owns the ship? Who insures the cargo? Which bank clears the transaction? Which port accepts the vessel? Which trading house signs the contract? Which company still needs U.S. equipment, U.S. software, U.S. investors, or access to U.S. capital markets? That is where Washington still has leverage. The U.S. sanctions system is powerful because the dollar sits at the center of global finance, but also because America and its allies still control many of the institutions and services that make global trade function. Shipping insurance, major banks, commodity trading networks, maritime classification, technology supply chains, and access to Western markets all create pressure points. So even in a yuan-based oil trade, the U.S. can still ask every participant a brutal question. Do you want this Iranian cargo badly enough to risk the American system? For some Chinese refiners, the answer may be yes. For globally exposed firms, the answer may be no. That is the emerging split. A domestic-facing Chinese refinery with limited overseas financing, limited dollar exposure, and strong political protection from Beijing may continue buying Iranian crude. It can live inside the Chinese system. It can use yuan. It can rely on Chinese banks. It can avoid Western counterparties as much as possible. But a Chinese company with Singapore subsidiaries, foreign investors, global brokers, Western equipment, dollar debt, or overseas ambitions has a much harder choice. That is why Hengli is such a useful case. It shows both sides of the new reality. China can protect companies at home. The U.S. can still make those same companies uncomfortable abroad. This is not the death of American sanctions. It is the beginning of a more contested sanctions world. Russia, after 2022, gives us a preview. After Western sanctions, Russia moved more trade into rubles, yuan, and non-Western channels. It found new buyers for oil. It built shadow shipping routes. It used intermediaries. It created alternative payment paths. It did not collapse. But it also did not become free from pressure. Russia still struggled with shipping insurance, high-end technology imports, aircraft parts, financial access, and the constant friction of doing business through indirect channels. Sanctions did not stop everything, but they made everything more expensive, slower, riskier, and more dependent on friendly or opportunistic partners. That is the lesson for China and Iran. A country can reroute money faster than it can rebuild the entire commercial ecosystem around that money.
China is trying to build that ecosystem, but it is not finished. The yuan is more important than it used to be, but it is still far from replacing the dollar globally. Chinese banks are stronger than before, but many still fear being cut off from dollar clearing. Chinese shipping and insurance capacity is growing, but the old global system has deep roots. China can create protected corridors for sensitive trade, but it cannot yet make the whole world ignore U.S. sanctions.
This is why Beijing's move should not be exaggerated, but it also should not be dismissed. China is not saying it is immune. China is saying American jurisdiction has limits. That is a serious statement. For Washington, this is a direct challenge to the logic of secondary sanctions. If the U.S. can sanction any foreign company that trades with Iran, and if every major economy obeys, then American sanctions become global rules. But if China refuses, and if enough companies can survive inside China's alternative system, then U.S. sanctions become powerful, but no longer universal. That is the real strategic tension. The United States wants to preserve a system where access to the dollar, American markets, and Western institutions gives it enforcement power far beyond its borders. China wants to build a world where that power no longer automatically applies to Chinese trade with third countries. Iran is the testing ground because Iranian oil is exactly the kind of trade where the two visions collide. It is sanctioned by America, it is useful to China, it is profitable for intermediaries. It can be settled outside the dollar. It can move through shadow networks. It gives Beijing a practical way to test how much U.S. pressure can still hurt. This also reveals something important about de-dollarization. De-dollarization is not a dramatic ceremony where countries gather in a room, declare the end of the dollar, and cut a ribbon while a nervous banker faints in the corner. It happens quietly.
It happens when a refinery pays in yuan. It happens when a sanctioned country stores revenue in Chinese banks. It happens when a trader uses a non-Western shipping network. It happens when a government tells its companies not to obey foreign sanctions. It happens when the cost of avoiding the dollar becomes lower than the cost of obeying Washington. That is why this refinery case matters. It is a small transaction-level battle inside a much larger structural shift. The world is not moving into a clean post-dollar order. It is moving into a fragmented order where different blocks create different financial and legal zones. In one zone, OFAC rules dominate. Banks overcomply. Traders avoid sanctioned names. Insurance firms walk away. Companies treat U.S. sanctions as global law because the cost of disobedience is too high. In another zone, China tries to create protection. Firms use yuan. Domestic banks handle payments. Beijing issues blocking orders. Sanctioned trade continues through channels that are harder for Washington to reach. Most companies do not want to choose between these worlds because choosing is expensive. The profitable dream is to sell to China, borrow in dollars, use Western insurance, access U.S. markets, and buy discounted Iranian crude without consequences. That dream is dying. The future will force companies to decide which system matters more to them. For a global bank, the U.S. system will usually matter more.
For a local refinery buying cheap crude, China's protection may matter more. For a shipping firm, it depends on its fleet, insurance, flags, routes, and appetite for risk. For Beijing, the goal is not to make every Chinese company immune tomorrow. The goal is to make U.S. sanctions less decisive over time. That is the deeper strategy. China does not need to defeat the dollar in one move. It only needs to create enough alternative channels that American sanctions no longer function as an on-off switch. If sanctions become a cost rather than a death sentence, the balance changes. That is what Washington fears. Because sanctions are not only about punishment, they are about deterrence. The power of a sanction is strongest before it is used, when companies avoid certain behavior because they believe the penalty would be unbearable. If Chinese firms begin to believe they can survive the penalty, especially with Beijing's backing, then the psychological power of sanctions weakens. That does not mean China can ignore the U.S. completely. It cannot. China still depends on global markets.
Its major banks are deeply connected to the international system. Its manufacturers need export markets. Its technology sector still faces choke points. Its companies often need foreign capital, overseas subsidiaries, and access to international customers.
This is why Beijing's pushback is careful. It is aggressive enough to challenge Washington, but not reckless enough to blow up the entire relationship. China is defending specific firms, specific transactions, and a specific principle. The U.S. should not be able to dictate Chinese trade with Iran through unilateral sanctions. That principle sounds legal, but it is geopolitical. It is about who writes the rules when the world is no longer unipolar. The United States still has enormous power. China now has enough power to resist in selected areas. Iran benefits from that resistance because it gives Tehran a financial lifeline. Smaller countries watch carefully because they want to know whether the American sanctions system is still unavoidable or whether there is now another path. That is why this story should be read as a preview. The next era of sanctions will not look like the old era. It will be less clean. It will involve more shadow fleets, more alternative currencies, more legal blocking orders, more pressure on banks, more conflict over shipping insurance, and more companies caught between rival legal systems. The question will not be whether the U.S. can still sanction Chinese companies. It can. The question is whether those sanctions still produce obedience. That is a different question, and it is much harder. If a Chinese company needs Wall Street, Western insurers, American technology, and global investors, U.S. sanctions can still be devastating. If a company lives mostly inside China's domestic economy and does politically protected trade with yuan, the damage may be manageable.
That creates a world where sanctions work unevenly. They hit some firms like a hammer. They hit others like a tax. And once sanctions become a tax, companies begin to calculate. That is the danger for Washington. The Hengli case is therefore not just about whether one refinery bought Iranian crude. It is about whether China can absorb U.S. punishment and keep trading anyway. It is about whether yuan settlement can protect politically sensitive commerce. It is about whether American sanctions remain global commands or become one side's rules in a divided system. Beijing's message is clear. You can sanction Iran. You can sanction Chinese firms. You can threaten banks and traders and ships. But you do not get to assume that Chinese companies will automatically obey. And you do not get to assume that China will help enforce your rules. That is a major shift.
For years, China often avoided direct confrontation on sanctions by letting smaller firms operate in the gray zone while larger institutions stayed cautious. Now Beijing is putting more political weight behind resistance. It is saying that sanctions are not only an economic weapon, but also a sovereignty issue. That is why this moment feels different. The United States is defending the reach of its financial power. China is defending the boundaries of its own jurisdiction. Iranian oil is the cargo, but the cargo is carrying something much heavier than crude. It is carrying the question of who gets to decide what global trade is allowed to happen. For the last generation, the answer was usually Washington. China is now trying to make the answer less obvious. And that is why a refinery in Dalian has become a test case for the future of the world economy.